House Energy Policy Committee will come to order. Clerk, if you would, please call the roll.
Mr. Chair.
Here.
Representatives Hauk. Here. Barrett. Here. Coles. Tedder. Bolino. Here. Farrington. Here. Griffin. Johnson. Here. Lefebvre. Lauer. Here. Riley. Here. Lazinski.
Here.
Dianda. Garrett. Camilleri. Here. Elder. Here. Green. Here. Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. By the way, we're going by Greenwich Mean Time, which I assume is reflected by my cell phone, but that clock back there seems to be a little slow. And I need a motion to approve the minutes from last week's meeting. Vice Chair Hauk makes that motion. Without objection, so ordered. We're going to have today testimony from various entities involved in transmission in the state of Michigan. I'm going to have to absent myself for about the first 15 minutes. Vice Chair Hauk is going to chair the hearing. We certainly welcome you folks today and the testimony you're going to provide. And I know Vice Chair Hauk is going to make sure that Representative Bolino gets a question, and anybody else who has one. Hopefully I'll be back in 15 to 20 minutes. Vice Chair Hauk.
All right, welcome everyone. If we could have our first people up here to give their presentation. Do I read this first? This is Simon Whitelock, and they represent ITC.
Morning. Hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for allowing us to come in today and speak. I am Simon Whitelock. I'm president of ITC Michigan, and hope to come in today and give you an overview of what ITC does. I know some people are familiar with ITC and others aren't, so forgive me if I'm telling you something you haven't heard before, but I'm not sure. Because of who we are and what we do, we're not exactly a household name for everyone, so just want to make sure that you have the background on who ITC is. And please stop me at any time if you have any questions. Sometimes in this business we talk about a lot of acronyms and things like that. I'm going to do my best to explain what those are, but if you're not sure what I'm speaking about, please stop me. I'm happy to take questions at any time. So just a little bit about ITC. We're a transmission-only company. We're headquartered right here in Michigan. We've been in business since 2003, and we're in the business of high-voltage transmission infrastructure. And since 2003, we've invested over $6 billion in infrastructure in 8 states. We cover about 15 or 16,000 miles of transmission lines, and we've got 600 employees, 600 plus employees, most of which are here in the state. On top of that, we've got another 500 plus dedicated contractors who work for us to perform most of our maintenance activities. We're a member of 4 regional transmission organizations, those are the RTOs, and we're mainly FERC regulated, but that's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We are also regulated by the Michigan Public Service Commission for things such as siting of certain transmission lines as well as other activities. So just a high-level view of the power flow process, just to give you a better sense of where we fit in. So we're the high-voltage transmission lines. We connect the generation to the distribution to the homes and businesses that actually consume the electricity. When we talk about transmission, it's really the bulk delivery system of electricity. So it's very high voltage. Think of the highways, if you will, if you use roads as an analogy. And since we started, we've really been committed to delivering customer benefits, and that's something we're very proud of. So improving reliability on our system, reducing congestion, thereby lowering cost, providing access to competitive energy markets, and facilitating interconnection of new generation. Those are things that we do day in, day out, and at the end of the day, it's all for the purpose of lowering the costs of electricity to customers. That's what transmission can provide, is the ability to connect the cheapest generation to the load or the customer. And we're very proud of our reputation. We've been, as I said, in business since 2003, and over that time we've been committed to the things I mentioned before, and we've done those things. And we've acquired 3 transmission systems over the course of that time. We've built another one from scratch down in Kansas and Oklahoma, and along the way we've really tried to take a step back and think about what's needed in transmission, not just in our service territory, but more broadly in the region. We've partnered with local utilities. We've interconnected a lot of generation, as I said before, and we've developed a steady stream of transmission projects. The next slide, we've got some system statistics, mainly just to give you a sense of how our company is spread out and the different systems that we operate. The 2 that we operate here in Michigan are called ITC Transmission and METC, and those were the original 2 systems that ITC has owned and operated. And as you can see from this slide, we acquired the assets for the ITC transmission system back in 2003 and the METC system back in 2006. So we've had quite some time to be able to operate these systems. The circuit miles data on this slide is combined, so our 2 companies combined, we've got about 8,700 miles of transmission. We've got almost 56,000 towers and poles, 283 substations. We operate at various high voltages, and we've invested over $3 billion in our systems here in Michigan since that time, by replacing stuff that was old, needed to be replaced, lines, other equipment. We've built new lines, new substations, really tried to have a best-in-class transmission system here in the state, and our results have showed that to be true. On this chart, you can see one of the things that we really focus on from a metrics perspective is our outage frequency. And on the left-hand side, you have our original system, ITC transmission. You can see where things were when we took over in 2003, and we've reduced those outages considerably over that time by about 40%. And on the METC transmission system, we've also had a significant reduction, not as much as in ITC transmission, but really that stems from focusing on operational excellence, doing maintenance, preventative maintenance, upgrading the facilities as we talked about, really doing after-action reviews of why problems are being caused in the first place to make the improvements. And I think it's just important to note, when we talk about transmission outages, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a customer outage. It just means there's a line out of service that shouldn't be, and that can cause other problems such as reliability or congestion on the system, so we take that very seriously. Just to give you a sense of who our customers are, I mean, we are the transmission provider for Consumers Energy, for DTE, for municipal utilities, for cooperative utilities, but we also have end-use customers that are connected directly to our systems at very high voltage. So think of very energy, electric intensive processes or factories tend to be connected directly to our system. So this is a sampling of some of the companies that we connect directly to. Although they are customers of DTE or consumers, they connect directly to our system. So when it comes to reliability and making sure the delivery of energy is there, it's something that we have to be very, very vigilant about, keeping those factories online. And along with that comes a really strong customer focus. So we've been very collaborative, really focusing on our customers since day one. And we've done that so that we can make the improvements that are needed in reliability and focus on operational excellence. And I think at the end of the day, provide more reliable service, better power quality, and that showed up. And right now, the economy being very strong in the state, which is a fantastic thing, that's leading to even more requests for interconnection. We just finished a project in Coldwater where we the work that we did allowed Clemens, a hog processing facility, to become operational. Various data centers are being built in the state, as well as other manufacturing. So we have a very active role in that sort of economic development side of things, where we have to make sure we are in lockstep with what's going on and get our work done fast, so that those facilities can come online as quickly as possible. Project management is something else that we really focus on. Not going to spend too much time on this slide, but needless to say, we have a lot of projects going on, and really focus on making sure that they're done efficiently. There's a lot of complex things that have to be coordinated, and a lot of activities that go into the projects, but needless to say, it's something that we're very focused on, keeping projects on schedule and on budget. When it comes to day-to-day operations, we really have we've got maintenance, capital projects, and just day-to-day operations. So when we talk about maintenance in the field, we talked about our field operations. We have a crew of over 500, as I said before, and they're operating ITC's equipment. We've got warehouses and facilities spread throughout the state so that we can respond in times of outages or bad weather, etc. And they're the folks that are actually the boots on the ground that perform our maintenance and some smaller capital projects for us. And as I said before, we have a project management focus, so we can complete large capital projects. Here's an example of one in the Thumb Loop. We completed a pretty large transmission project. It was 140 miles of 345 kV, so that's pretty high voltage. And that project was completed a couple years ago, but really the aim was to increase the capacity in the Thumb area, interconnect new generation, and improve the reliability in that region. So really, the project really completed a lot of things at the same time. In terms of our maintenance focus, we really focus on preventative maintenance. One of the things that we've found over time is if you do the preventative maintenance, you have less reactive maintenance. That costs less money, you have better reliability, and it's a lot more predictable environment. So we do a lot of activities such as aerial patrols, real-time monitoring of equipment to see if things are getting out of whack. And then, as I said before, when something does happen, we investigate it thoroughly to understand the root cause and then take action so that we don't have repeats. The other aspect of maintenance that we do that you may hear more about is on the vegetation management side of things. Tree-caused outages are actually not allowed anymore. The 2003 blackout was actually caused by contact with a tree, and since that time there are mandatory standards around what vegetation has to happen, and if you have an outage, there's severe penalties for that. So it's something we take very seriously. And we've ramped up our program over the last decade to really address those types of outages and make sure that they don't happen. In terms of storm restoration, I touched on this a little bit, but obviously restoring in the case of a storm is mission critical, and we have a supply chain network and a field force that is in place to take care of things when they go wrong. We also participate in mutual assistance programs, so we're helping others out when their systems are in need, and vice versa. They can help us too if necessary. Back in March, I'm sure you heard, we had a pretty big windstorm. Proud to say our system really weathered that storm really well. We had no sustained outages, and our system really stood up strong, I think, in part to the vegetation management that we'd done in the past, as well as a lot of the upgrades to older equipment that we had done really resulted in tremendous performance, and we were able to instead help others on their systems in neighboring utilities, and that really helped speed up the restoration efforts. One of the things that's really on top of our minds these days is sort of the theme of resiliency, physical security, not just in the face of storms, but also, there are threats, other threats out there, man-made threats that we have to focus on, and there's a lot of discussion about this. So we're very focused on it in terms of assessing where we stand, making improvements to make sure that our system's hardened, and doing a lot of monitoring, outreach with law enforcement, outreach with communities, making sure that we have good communication in case something does go wrong. It's, you know, it's one of those things. It's a never-ending process, but something we take very seriously. Talked about the partnerships. I mean, it's really, you know, working closely with law enforcement, communities, different levels of government, state government, federal government. There's a pretty good community that's come up to really address these issues, and I think that's something that's going to evolve in time. On the other side, you have the cybersecurity, and that's evolving by the minute, literally. I mean, our CIO yesterday said that there's 600 new worm viruses developed per minute. You know, that's the type of pace that things are changing at, and we have to make sure that we're on top of that. So really employing a defense in-depth strategy there, multiple layers, participating in many of the same external groups that really focus on this. I think when you think about our business, one of the challenges that we have is that our equipment is spread out so far and wide. We have systems that send data back and forth from the piece of equipment in the field to our control room in Novi, and we have to make sure that that data is accurate and intact, as well as our systems back in our control rooms to make sure that there's integrity of that system, so that there's a lot of data flowing on our systems, and that sort of cybersecurity element is mission critical for us in terms of maintaining reliability. At the end of the day, I think, you know, when you think of our value proposition, really it's about building a better and stronger grid, ensuring that customers are connected to the energy that they need, and as I said before, making sure that there's or enabling a strong market for electricity. So transmission system really facilitates that market to take place, and having a strong system makes the most of a market. Some of the things that we've tried to measure in terms of our value provided, or value proposition, we engaged a firm called ICF International a couple years ago to take a look at some of the projects that we've done, and this is one example. Because of the way that we've interconnected new generation, that generation has been located in efficient zones. It's required less of it to be built, less transmission to be built, which results in literally hundreds of millions of dollars saved by the process that we've undertaken to do that, and we're proud of that. In terms of market efficiency, so having a robust system, thinking of the market itself and how the market operates, making sure that the transmission system is not congested. That's resulted in roughly 100 and some million over just a 5-year period. So that just gives you a sense of the value and the power of transmission in terms of what it can do. The other element that's really important, obviously, is the economy and jobs, and looking at what we've done since 2004, or in 2014, just our work, our operating expenses, capital maintenance, helped support 3,000 jobs and $270 million of spending in the state's economy. And about 70% of our spending is actually staying in this state. So something we really try and focus on, you know, using local companies to the extent that we can, and understanding the impact of our activities on the economy. And then thinking about a bill, you know, so where do we fit into the bill? You don't get a separate bill for transmission. It's part of your electric bill from whoever your electric utility is. And in Michigan, the transmission component of the bill is about 4%, so it's a pretty small piece of the bill relative to the national average, which is about 9%. So we're doing pretty well there. But despite just being 4% of the bill, you know, we have a pretty significant impact on especially the generation portion of the bill, the 60% of the bill. So that's something we're very cognizant of in everything that we do. Taking a little bit of a step back and just thinking about some of the broader issues that are facing transmission companies, you know, electrical industry. I think when you think about the system that's in place, much of it was built back in 60s, 50s, 70s, you know, decades ago. This equipment is built to last 50 or 60 years, but we're kind of coming up on the end of life for a lot of the equipment that we have across the country. I mean, as I said before, we've done a lot of work to modernize the infrastructure that we have in this state, but that's a challenge that's out there. Sort of the technological changes that are happening. You have a pretty big shift in the generation fleet, retiring of power plants, new technologies coming online, and new ways to do things. So, you know, I think the industry at large is facing a lot of change. You've probably heard some of that already from others that have come in, and I think it's important for us that we keep pace with that change. One of the challenges that we have, to be frank, is when constructing a transmission line, especially a new line, you know, that's a 5 to 10 year proposition at best. It's not something that happens overnight, so we have to be looking pretty far down the road to see what's needed and make sure that the system that's in place 10 years from now is what's going to be needed at that point in time. Here's some stats on the changing generation mix. You can see back in 2000, 52% was coal, and you know, projecting somewhere around 30% by 2040. This is from a couple years ago. This data may be old. You can see renewables definitely shifting in the opposite direction, and natural gas picking up from nuclear. So significant changes over time. And here in Michigan, we've seen similar shifts. So this is a pie chart just representing the new generation that we've interconnected in the state. And you can see over 60% of it has been renewables, 32% natural gas, and the rest other stuff. So the shift is happening here at home too. Talked a little bit about some of the new demands, you know, distributed generation, demand response, efficiency, electric vehicles, electrification of other things, renewable energy technologies shifting rapidly. Customers are a lot more aware and a lot more demanding of their electric sources and supply, and that's changing the way we do things. We've got a lot of regulatory issues out there, from, you know, Clean Power Plan, which probably has gone away. But the distributed generation, as I said before, integrated resource plans, RPS standards, security, regulation, production tax credits. On the transmission front, FERC Order 1000 came out back in 2011, and that was introduced to reform planning for transmission as well as cost allocation. And the goal was really to create a more competitive wholesale market for electricity and remove some of the barriers that may have existed to building transmission. In Order 1000, another thing it did was remove the protection for incumbent transmission developers and owners to construct certain projects. Some states responded by passing legislation to eliminate that competition at the state level. Michigan has not done that, so Michigan is a competitive state. So any project that would come up in Michigan that meets the criteria for competition would be subject to competition at MISO, which is one of the RTOs in Michigan, or PJM. So that process exists in Michigan. But no projects have come up that are subject to competition yet in Michigan. And there really haven't been that many out there that have come up yet. I think MISO has had one, and SPP has had one, PJM has had a couple, so it's, we're 6 or 7 years into our Order 1000. There really hasn't been a ton of activity yet. I think time will tell what that brings. So thinking about Michigan a little bit more in terms of the challenges we face, we talked about the coal plants being retired, a lot of new forms of generation coming online. We've had a lot of wind. There's a lot of new solar that's coming up these days. Energy efficiency is something that's being focused on. We have a lot more focus on security, as we talked about before, the environment, and other energy-related policies. And things are happening outside of the state that affect the state too. So it's not just what happens in this state. The grid is connected within the Eastern Interconnection. I mean, the grid spans coast to coast and north to south. So this is a pretty interconnected system. And at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we have a robust system in place to deal with these changes. So that's something that we're focused on. As we look forward, as I said before, we're focused on the connection that the customer has to their source of electricity. We're making sure that we're dealing with that energy landscape and addressing things that are coming up. And we're committed to being a good steward of the grid, making sure we respect the environment and focus on the customer at the end of the day, because that's really what it's all about. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Yes. Thank you. We have a question from Representative Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. You touched base on cyber strategy. Can you expand on that, or what are your future plans for continuing grid security from a cyber threat?
Sure, I'd be happy to, if I may respond. Cyber security, it's evolving, like that. So some of the things that we've done over the last couple of years are we've created dedicated cybersecurity teams at ITC, whereas before it was spread throughout the IT department, so to speak. Now we have a cybersecurity command center. We have folks who are strictly focused on cybersecurity. That is their job, as opposed to it being, embedded in somebody else's job. That's one thing we've done. We're investing in the tools in terms of staying aware of what's happening externally. We were made aware. There was a worm last 2 weekends ago that came up, and in the U.S. we seemed to weather that storm pretty well. Other countries didn't do as well, but we were notified fairly early on that there was a problem before others had been notified. And as it turned out, because of our patch management system and our update management system, we actually had already installed the updates that were needed to prevent that worm from. So it's things like that. It's making sure you're staying up on your patches. You're connected to the outside world so that there's a sharing of information in terms of where the threats are. If something's come up, you're aware of it. You can take action. I think with that worm, we found a few devices that had not been updated for whatever reason, and we were able to basically shut them down until they were updated. So really making sure you're aware of your system, and the industry has responded. We talked about the blackout of 2003 caused by vegetation, but one of the focus areas is also on the cyber front, and it's called Critical Infrastructure Protection, or CIP as we call it. And the other half of the focus is, there's this physical maintenance and what you're doing, in the field, but the other half is really on the cyber side of things. And there's a lot of standards that are coming at us very quickly, and the industry is racing to stay up, and it really focuses on the cyber front. So, I think it's a multiple layered approach to things. It's upgrading the systems we have. It's connecting to the outside world. It's, making sure that we've got best practices in place.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Representative Dianda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony here today, sir. A couple of questions that I have. First question is, we have a lot of discussion out there with competition, and you said that, you know, the market is open through the MISO project. So I want to have you explain to us that 4%, if you're doing 4% on your business, do you see anyone wanting to be involved with competition in the state of Michigan? That's my first question to you, sir.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's an astute observation. The sort of the slice of the pie is relatively small. As I said, the competitive process is in place. There hasn't been a lot of activity, so there have been a lot of entities that have signed up to participate in the process and have participated in the couple competitive processes that have existed. I think over time things shift depending on the project, depending on the circumstances. So I think if a project came up in Michigan, would there be a competitive? Absolutely. Yeah, I think, you know, there are a lot of entities out there that would go after a project here in the state. Yeah.
I can, Mr. Chair. The second question I would have too is that your company, do you have anything that you're looking at for future projects dealing with Michigan's Upper Peninsula?
Thank you for that question. That's something we've been looking at. As you can see from our service territory, we are focused on the Lower Peninsula of the state. We do not have any assets in the Upper Peninsula. One of the issues that has come up over the last couple of years is the supply of energy in the UP, the connectivity between the UP and the LP, and whether improving that connection would be a good thing for the state. So, you know, I think we would be happy to help with any solution or any project that would provide benefit. And if such a project came about and went through a good process to study the project, to evaluate it, make sure it was the right thing to do, I mean, we'd be happy to participate in such a project. There's nothing on the table at this moment like that, but it's something that because we're a Michigan company, we're very interested in making sure that you know, customers' needs are met wherever they may be.
Just to follow up, Mr. Chair, not to take over for Representative Glenn, our chair. I just have the other question I'd have too with this. Is there anybody else that's qualified currently in Michigan to be able to have any competition? Is there any other company with your stature that would have the ability to even put in any type of bid on this as a Michigan company?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you think about who are the transmission owning entities in this state, it's ITC. We have the bulk of the Lower Peninsula. ATC is the provider in the Upper Peninsula. We have many municipal utilities that are transmission owners. We have cooperative utilities that are transmission owners. AEP is a transmission owner in the southwest portion of the state. I think even Xcel Energy may have. So I think folks within the state already, there are many that would be qualified to compete or bid on a project that came up that was subject to competition. So yes.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Other questions? Representative Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and if I may, I've got a couple of questions here, if you could indulge me for that, please. Thank you very much for your presentation. Really appreciate that. It's something that we've talked about over the last couple of years or so is the transmission piece, and especially referring to Representative DeAnda, good colleague from the Upper Peninsula, about connectivity to the Upper Peninsula. How much of your business is in other states?
Probably half. Probably about half. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but just thinking roughly, you know, about half of our business is in other states.
Okay, thank you. And if I may continue, Mr. Chair, have you utilized eminent domain clauses in other states to complete projects?
I guess going back to the overview of ITC, you know, we're a utility in Michigan, Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Missouri, now Wisconsin, Kansas, and Oklahoma. So I don't know that for certain, but probably at some point. You know, I think most projects don't require the use of eminent domain, but some do.
Okay. So as a Michigan-based company, you've potentially used that tool in other states to complete projects?
I think so, yes.
Okay. Also, continuing on a similar line, has your company worked to eliminate barriers to allow ITC the ability to bid on projects in other states with other legislatures?
Yes, we've worked. Actually, Sharon and I were, or Segner and I were talking earlier. We a couple of years ago worked in New Mexico. There, as I mentioned in earlier, one of the things that Order 1000, FERC Order 1000 allows is for states to pass legislation that would prevent the competitive aspect of Order 1000. Michigan doesn't have that such legislation, but other states do, and some have tried to pass laws like that. And Sharon and I had worked on there was some legislation proposed in New Mexico a couple of years. So yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and look forward to your company working to for the One Michigan project and working to connect the peninsulas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Cole. And now, Representative Bellino.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's good to get a question in once a month. It's an inside joke, sir. Nothing
You're
unusual.
going to be at the top of my list from now on. So,
Thank you, sir. Explain to me the competition you were talking about earlier on projects. And do we have state statutes that allow competition of bidding on transmission projects?
Thank you for the question. If I may respond, Mr. Chairman. There are no statutes that prevent competition that I'm aware of in the state of Michigan.
Thank you.
follow up to that, is there legislation that limits the number of those who would qualify to compete?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, if I may respond. I'm not aware of any legislation that limits who can compete for projects. As I said before, I don't know if you were back in the room when I talked about this, but there are states that have such legislation, call it ROFR legislation, which would prevent any kind of competition. We don't have anything like that here in Michigan. So if a project were to come up at MISO or PJM, which are the two RTOs that Michigan transmission falls into, if a project came up that met the criteria for the project to be competitive, and there's only certain projects that would fall into that category, I think a project like that would go through the competitive process.
So any entity that wanted to bid on such a project, whether located in Michigan or anywhere else in the country, would be free to bid or compete as you see the law?
I think so. As I said before, we haven't had a project like that come up, so but I believe that it would be a very competitive environment for a Michigan project.
Okay, thank you. Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple questions, if I may. First question regarding the generating side. Let's say it was cheaper to generate out of state, say a wind farm in Iowa or a gas plant in Ohio. Would it be your opinion that we should prioritize cheaper energy out of state over building a power plant in Michigan that would be more expensive?
Thank you for the question. I think I'm not a transmission planner, so I'm going to, there are others in the room that are, so please indulge me in responding. But I think at the end of the day, we have an interconnected grid. Michigan is connected to Ontario, it's connected to Ohio, it's connected to Indiana from a transmission perspective. So the electricity is already flowing across state lines. It doesn't recognize state borders. It flows where it needs to flow. So in the process of evaluating projects, that's something that's there's a need for local generation there's a need to maximize the most cost-effective generation, and you have to balance those two things. So you can't say all. It's never one or the other. It's a mixture. But I do think at the end of the day, we're trying to provide customers with affordable and reliable electricity, and you have to evaluate the resources that are available, and if that's possible and makes sense, then yes, that should be done, but not at the expense of reliability or other factors. We have to keep the lights on at the end of the day.
I would agree that the cheapest electricity is the best electricity. My second question, you talked about the electric bill and you were comparing it to the rest of the country using percentage of the bill, ours being 4% versus the U.S. average of 9%. Would you be willing to, do you know the dollars and cents, how we compare to the rest of the country versus just percentage of the bill?
Thank you for that question. That's a complicated question to answer. I think it depends on how you look at it. If you're looking at it in terms of energy or demand, and it depends on who you're comparing. Is it residential, industrial? But I think we're doing pretty well. I think we're at least average. I'd like to think we're above average in terms of, or below average, lower than average in cost. I don't have those numbers in front of me. I think that's something we could follow up with you on.
Thank you.
Okay.
Vice Chair Lisinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Hope your morning was successful.
It was, I think.
Good. So I have a question on the setting of the rate, so a little bit of a follow-up on Representative Johnson's questions. How are transmission rates set in terms of how much you charge generation and distribution ends?
Thank you for the question. The transmission rates are set basically using a cost of service model. So it's a formulaic process where the inputs are the equipment that we have in service, the ongoing operating and maintenance costs. Sort of add those up, divide it by the use or the load, and that determines the rate. And that rate is updated on an annual basis and charged to customers in Michigan, the utilities that are connected to us, so Consumers Energy, DTE, the municipal electrics, the cooperatives that are transmission customers of ITCs.
So are you indifferent if there was a new project in terms of cost to build? So is yours essentially a cost recovery model, or is it a competitive pricing model?
As I said before, the way that the actual rate is set, you're sort of building up costs. When a project is proposed, it goes through the planning process at MISO, which is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. I didn't get into what MISO does, but there's a process there where stakeholders, customers, regulators review the project, propose alternatives, come up with different ways to doing things. The project starts looking one way, and when it comes out the other end, it's what everybody says, okay, that's what needs to get done. And then we actually go about building it. The competitive process comes when we actually go to build the project. We're dealing with multiple entities that are contractors, so we have a competitive process there to select who the builder is, and the supplier of the materials, labor, etc. So that competition comes in then once we've established what the right project is to be built.
Okay, so if we're looking at setting a new project, then the state has input on what that project looks like, what the size is, what the best way is to determine, and then you are simply charging back the amount of energy that goes through that divided by the usage,
the cost,
as you were saying, by the cost of the lines?
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Once that process is over, then it would go into our bill along with all the other costs that we have of operating the system. The control rooms, the maintenance, the field operations, etc. Those costs get included with those existing costs.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Lisinski. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, different subject here. You mentioned a little bit about the security of the system, and I think most of us are really just concerned that, especially with just hearing like just having trees fall on lines, how it caused an issue in the past, and all our grids are connected. It just seems it's almost impossible to protect the grid. Is there things that we can do, and federally, is there anything going on to protect the grid?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman, if I may respond. It is something that everybody in the industry is concerned about. Used to be, we worried about weather, trees, and kids, and now you have to worry about grown people doing things intentionally. So we are very focused on that and have been doing things over the last decade really to physically harden the system, from protecting substations where transformers and other critical equipment are. We have things like cameras and motion detectors, and that's all monitored in our security command center, so that if there is some sort of intrusion, we're aware of it. We can act quickly and take measures. But as you mentioned, this system is spread out. It is impossible to protect everything, so we have to focus on the most critical elements, and then also rely on the planning process, which plans for events and contingencies. Things go wrong, whether it's a piece of equipment fails or any other reason. Elements of the system are out. The system is built to withstand some outages, so we have that sort of resiliency baked into the system. But I think now we're focused on, okay, what more do we need to do to make sure that we're prepared from a physical perspective?
So federally, is this done from a federal level then? Is that all the other companies that are doing the same thing you are talking out of the same and are talking to each other?
Yes, there are, as I mentioned, there are mandatory reliability standards. That's one element. There are directives to do certain things, alerts. This is a threat. This is something that folks need to focus on. There are industry groups. The North American Transmission Forum is a group of transmission owners from across the country that get together and compare notes on things like this. So you can say, okay, well, what's everybody else doing? Why are they doing it? Should we be doing that too? So there's a good information sharing system in place to be able to compare notes with your peers and make sure that you're not falling behind. So that's something we do. We participate in extensively, things like that, to make sure that we're staying on top of what we need to. But at the end of the day, hardening, protecting certain elements seems to be the way to go. Really focusing on those, and then making sure you have a plan in place for restoration, recovery on the physical side.
Thank you. Representative LaFave.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for coming before us today. Just so I have a better understanding of how it works, is there transmission in between PJM and MISO? Or are they completely walled off from each other?
Thank you for the question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the systems are interconnected. So you have a set of lines, and they're very much connected to each other. It's not walled off. It's more of responsibility for monitoring falls with certain entities. So we have this very large region. It gets broken up into smaller parts, and the responsibility for the planning, for the real-time monitoring, the market operation falls with different entities, but they're all dealing with each other, and sort of the interconnectedness. That's just a daily reality of operating transmission system.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Chair, if I have...
Sure.
Like the representative from Calumet mentioned, the UP, we do have an energy problem, and I have also agree we need some, or I believe we need some transmission to help us out in addition to other things. One particular thing is we've been talking about the 2003 blackout that affected the East Coast and the Lower Peninsula, one of the reasons that the UP still had the lights on is because we really didn't have any connectivity between the peninsulas. There is, but it's not very significant. If we were to put a connective line between the two peninsulas, or between Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Canada, are there safeguards we can put in, like a surge protector? And I know that's not really exactly what it would be, but is there something we can put in that would stop it and not put the Upper Peninsula at the mercy of New York's energy problems, basically?
Thank you for that question. If I may respond, Mr. Chairman. I would like to think that we've come a long way since 2003. I think there were a lot of lessons learned after that blackout, some of which I've talked about changing. I think operationally a lot of changes occurred too in terms of communication, awareness of situations. The entire eastern interconnection did not go dark after that blackout, and so, for example, I believe the consumer's energy system was able to separate itself and remain with power during that blackout. So I think the answer is yes. There are tools and techniques that can be employed to make sure that you're not affected on such a widespread event were to occur. And I think the changes in the industry have been significant since that time, and likely would prevent something like that from happening again.
Representative DeAnda for the last question for this witness, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's been a lot of talk about a Michigan system as one. And I wanted to ask you your opinion then on a ballpark of what the cost of that infrastructure would be. And then who would pay for that piece of that infrastructure investment? Would that be a UP issue, Bill, or would that be a statewide cost?
Thank you for that question. If I may respond, Mr. Chairman. I think that's a good question. I don't know the cost. If you're talking about connecting the peninsulas, I think it depends on the solution. Likely, hundreds of millions probably, but it all depends on what else has to happen to make that work. And in terms of who would pay for it, the principle in transmission planning is the beneficiary of the project should pay for the project. In the case of such a project, because it's connecting the two peninsulas, I think you would argue that both peninsulas would be benefiting and should pay. In what proportion, I think that would probably need to be determined, but that's sort of this is a pretty off-the-cuff response for you here. But I think, and then within MISO, where this project would fall, there are other cost allocation methodologies, and depending on the type of project, it could also be spread more broadly than just the state, depending on who else is benefiting from the project. So I think it depends on the project, depends on how it comes to be, who is benefiting from it, and then that would determine who would pay for it.
Just follow up, Mr. Chair, real quick. So we're looking at 350,000 people in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So that would be something that possibly could be bared by that population source for the cost. Has there been any other areas across the states that has had this unique situation that has bared a cost of that type of infrastructure cost?
Thanks for that question. If I may respond, Mr. Chairman, I don't know. I recognize, I think population and low density, and those are some of the challenges with resolving some of the issues in the UP, and I think you have to be very mindful of the end use customer at the end of the day, what the impact on their bill is. I mean, that's something that has to be considered when a solution is determined. That's absolutely critical.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Mr. Whitelock, thank you for your testimony this morning.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We'll now have Sharon Segner with LS Power Transmission Holdings and Doug Collins with Gridliance. If you folks would come up, please. And we've got roughly 30 minutes, so I know our committee members like to ask questions. So maybe give us 5 or 10 minutes as a formal presentation, and then we'll let the committee members' questions direct the remainder of our time. Thank you, and welcome.
Sure, is this our? Which one?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Sharon Segner, and I'm a vice president with LS Power. We very much appreciate the opportunity to provide a few comments today on the state of the competitive pressures in Maryland in the world of transmission, and why, in our perspective, of why the status quo is an issue. And again, first a little bit of background on my company, and then also Gridliance, who's also presenting, will present some background as well, and then dive immediately into the substance of the matter. So first, an introduction in terms of LS Power. LS Power is a large power generation and transmission company. We own assets all over the United States on the power generation side as well as on the electric transmission side. Our company was founded in 1990, and the roots of our company is on the generation side, and in the last decade we have moved into the electric transmission side. So you can see from the project portfolio map on your screen that we have transmission assets today operating and existing in the state of Nevada as well as in the state of Texas and Delaware, New Jersey under development, and under development in Indiana. And then associated with our company, we also have generation assets scattered throughout the United States and the Midwest. And so behind our company, we have invested in the last, since 2005, $30 billion in electric transmission and generation. And so we have strong capabilities to execute and also fully comply with the law as it relates to reliability issues on the transmission side, as well as control centers and anything related to cybersecurity as well associated with our transmission assets. Whoops.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, representatives. My name is Doug Collins. I'm president for Gridliance for the region, which includes Michigan, Northern Midwest ISO. We were formed in 2014 with the purpose of helping public power, both from a reliability perspective, but also from an investment perspective. They are typically underrepresented in transmission investment. And so with all the transmission investment that has occurred around the country, what has happened is they get a larger and larger bill on transmission, but they have no revenue stream to help offset that. And so we were formed to help with those two issues, improving their reliability when they've been ignored, as well as helping them to invest in the system so they have a revenue stream to help their retail customers. We currently own and operate 400 miles of transmission in Oklahoma. We purchased that. It was primarily Radial 69, and we are working to rebuild that and network for higher reliability. We've got a couple other transactions that we hope to close shortly, but that kind of depends on Mr. Trump and whether he nominates a couple more FERC commissioners so they have a quorum so they can approve those transactions. Although we were only formed in 2014, the leadership team and much of the staff are like me. They have over 30 years of experience in the industry. And so we've got a very robust team with expertise across several RTOs, Midwest ISO, Southwest Power Pool, PJM, and recently the California ISO. I'd like to move now into more of the presentation. As Mr. Whitelock said, there haven't been a whole lot of competitive projects under Order 1000. A lot of that has to do with the rules that are currently in place. As the RTOs set up their competitive processes, the rules today are not really conducive to coming out with competitive projects. And so we are working to help to correct that. And so the projects that we've got listed on this page, as you can see, the ones that have been out for competitive bid, if you look at the planning estimates, those are typically set by the RTOs for each project, and they're based on historic costs of the incumbent utilities. If you look at the cost caps of the winning bids, you'll see there were significant savings on those costs. In those bids, there were also significant technical and commercial innovation that we'll talk about in a little bit. And they contain cost containment as well as, in most places, caps on those, which does not occur for most transmission development. It is a cost-based rate, and whatever it costs to build is what the utility recovers. As Mr. Whitelock alluded to, with the changing generation, the transition in generation energy supply, there's a lot of transmission development that will be needed. The estimate is in the billions of dollars. And so as we transition to more renewables, less coal, you need a new transmission system, but also because of the technical differences between those types of generation, you need a much more robust system to be able to handle some of the things that happen in outages that cause things like the blackout. Page 5 lists the people that are qualified transmission developers. These are the entities which can bid on MISO or PJM projects. As you can see, the lists are quite lengthy. They have all gone through a vetting process to make sure that they can perform if they're awarded a bid. There was a question earlier on whether if there was a competitive project in Michigan, would there be robust competition? And certainly, as Mr. Whitelock said, there is no ROFR that I'm aware of in Michigan. However, from a practical matter,
ROFR?
Right of first refusal.
Okay.
Sorry about that. And from a practical matter, there are laws in the book which limit entities that can use the right of eminent domain. I will tell you, over my career, the last thing I wanted to do was use eminent domain, but having it as a backstop is critical to being able to get projects implemented. And so I believe the way the laws are written today, in Michigan, the only entities that would be able to successfully bid on projects are those that currently have the right of eminent domain, which are the incumbent utilities. I think that if MISO had a project in Michigan, at least if I was running that part of the Midwest ISO, I would look at it as I would either limit the bids to that, or I would make sure the successful bidder had that ability, because you just would not be able to get the lines built without that. And that's critical if you're going to bid projects, that you have somebody that can actually complete the project.
Mr. Collins, can you be specific? You said the incumbent utilities.
I think that the ones I'm aware of are ITC, AEP, American Transmission Company, and possibly their affiliates.
And only those three, because they are the only ones that have eminent domain authority?
You could argue that the municipals and co-ops would have that ability, but they don't have the financial resources to do those.
See, Ms. Segner was shaking her head.
I I would clarify that the fundamental issue is that under Michigan law today, in order to apply for a certificate of public need and necessity, or essentially a permit to construct, you have to be deemed an independent transmission company. And so there's only a few entities on this list, which is basically the incumbent Michigan companies that qualify under that definition in Michigan law. And so basically these qualified developers, it's not just an issue of eminent domain. There's not the ability to apply and be granted a permit. And that is the fundamental question and problem under Michigan law, is the ability to apply to the State Public Service Commission, to the Michigan Public Service Commission, and say, we are requesting a permit to construct. And the state, in our view, should retain full control and ability to reject who they want in the state and who they don't want in the state. But right now, as the law reads, there's not the ability to be granted a permit. And so the state doesn't even have the ability to provide these permits. And then with that, under Michigan law, once there is a certificate process, eminent domain flows from that. But the fundamental issue is the ability to apply for a permit. And that's what's anti-competitive under the current Michigan law. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, Ms. Segner, that was very enlightening. So your position is diametrically in disagreement with Mr. Whitelock's statement that there is no impediment in current state law that would prevent anybody anywhere in the country that wanted to, aside from meeting the MISO qualifications, from being able to bid on a project in Michigan.
Well, I would say it's a difference in perspective in terms of what my view is that from a big picture perspective, when we talk about this competitive bidding process, okay, first of all, the first question is, who's running that competitive bidding process? Well, it's basically MISO or PJM, which sits over the multiple states to ensure that the lights stay on. And so a multi-state agency is essentially running a competitive bidding process to decide which project and which proposal is the strongest project to then move to the states for siting. And so basically ITC said in their testimony that there's not an impediment to the competitive bid process. So it's theoretically, MISO could have a competitive bid process. But the question is whether or not the winner could do anything with the win in Michigan. Because then the winner would then need to take the project to the state for approval or denial, and the state has full ability. And right now, under the Michigan law, there's not the ability, in our view, to receive the permit because of this arcane definition of independent transmission company that was basically put in place in, I believe, the early 2000s when restructuring happened in Michigan.
So you're saying you could make it through the MISO portion of any competitive bid process?
I think that the lawyers would probably argue back and forth over that point. I think that ITC took the position this morning that there could be a MISO competitive bid process. But the question is what happens to the winner of that process. And maybe just to move to the next slide, the reason that Michigan should care about the winner advancing is actually this next slide. Because what has happened in these limited competitive bid processes that have occurred in MISO and PJM and other regions is that competition and the power of competition and market forces has brought innovation. And basically what this slide shows is bidders in a recent MISO bid process in the state of Indiana. It's a project called Duff Coleman. And this chart is basically the 11 bidders, which on this chart are listed at bidders 101 through 111. And those are different qualified companies that are on this chart before that bid into the MISO competitive bid process. And basically what this chart shows is the type of cost and consumer innovation that was bid into the MISO competitive bid process. And so there was a particular transmission line that went out for bid. Some bidders said, hey, we're going to cap our capital cost. Other bidders said, hey, we're going to cap our return on equity. All of these things, we're going to cap our inflation risk. All of these things are critical components of the cost of a new transmission line. And the marketplace, when bidding occurred and competition occurred, all of a sudden said, we're going to shift the risk from the ratepayers, who typically bears the cost of cost overruns and the such, from the ratepayers to the developers. And you can see from this chart that 10 out of the 11 bidders bid some form of cost containment. And so what's happening under these limited Order 1000 windows is that when the windows occur, the marketplace sharpens their pencils. Qualified bidders, as we've seen before, sharpen their pencils and say, we would like this project, this is an attractive business model, and we would like to compete. And the consumers win in these cases for this competition. In Michigan, because there's not the ability to get a CPCN and a permit before the state commission, the question is then how would the winner
What's a
advance?
CPCN?
That is essentially the construction permit.
Okay.
That is granted by the Michigan Public Service Commission. And so after these projects go through the competitive bid process, the winner theoretically then goes to the state for permission to advance the project from a construction standpoint. There needs to, in our view, there needs to be the ability to for the winner to be granted a certificate in the state, and then with the state's permission, with that eminent domain authority would flow as well.
Let me ask you a question, then we got some other committee members who want a question. Is it correct that one of the requirements for being defined as an independent transmission company in Michigan law is that you have to have held holdings in the state of Michigan as of a certain date back in time?
Yes, that is correct. Yes, that is correct. And again, this is really a relic of legislation that passed, I believe, in the early 2000s when restructuring happened, in Michigan.
So if you didn't have holdings back in 2002, like Gridliance was formed in 2014. If you didn't have holdings back in 2002, you are not defined by Michigan law as an independent transmission company. Therefore, you can't actually do a project in the state of Michigan.
Yes, that's correct. And it's an issue of applying and being granted the CPCN in the state.
Okay.
And so it's really a modification that needs to address the changing marketplace and for the state to have the benefit of these competitive pressures that are occurring. And so if the winner of a MISO competitive process emerges, they would have the ability to come to the state and for the state to grant their approval or denial of the project. But the Michigan Public Service Commission retains full control and full decision-making authority over whether or not the project advances or not.
Thank you. Representative Lauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On this issue you just brought up related to the permit, I'm wondering, you said words like theoretical and this might happen. Has it ever been tested? Have you had somebody win the bid, go to the state, and then fail to get the permit because of this issue? Has it been tested?
It hasn't been tested, and the reason is because with these Order 1000 processes, we're still at the early stages of these competitive windows occurring, and so there hasn't been a MISO project yet that's occurred in the state of Michigan. But I can certainly say that my company hires and looks and studies the law quite carefully, and it's our view of this is what the challenge is.
And I'm taking that issue very seriously, but at the same time, it makes me uncomfortable to hear hypothetically or theoretical, considering you haven't tried it yet. You haven't tried to bid into the process and then get a permit. If you're coming here saying that we then couldn't get the permit, I think that'd have more weight to it.
Well, I would respectfully say that the definition of independent transmission company is very clear under existing Michigan law, and there is a date certain, tied that you have to owned assets in the state by a date certain. And I don't think there's much ambiguity on what the definition of an independent transmission company is, and that's why it should be addressed now, and it should also be addressed because you want these issues in the state law addressed before there's a competitive bid process, because you want these projects that are proposing cost containment to have the benefits and to advance after the competitive bid process.
I don't disagree with you. I want some clarification here then. So you're saying you absolutely would not be able to get a permit under that scenario under state law. It's not theoretical. You're saying you would not.
I am saying would not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Lauer. Representative Vice Chair Hauk.
Yes, thank you for coming in. Do either of you right now own assets in Michigan transmission lines?
No, we do not.
No.
No. Okay, thank you.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You touched on eminent domain, saying that the incumbent utilities have that privilege. You guys do not. That's putting you at a distinct disadvantage. Would you favor getting rid of the privilege that utilities currently have to use eminent domain?
We're not looking to change the eminent domain law. We're just looking to level the playing field so that those that want to build infrastructure have the ability to do that.
Thank you.
Representative DeAnda. Oh, go ahead.
I would just add that my company's belief is that eminent domain authority should flow from the certificate process in Michigan. And so basically we believe that eminent domain authority should be granted when there is a certificate issued, and that so because of that the state retains full control on when and the eminent domain can and can't be used.
My belief is that no one should have the right to steal someone else's property. But
thank you, Representative Johnson. Representative DeAnda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony today. Could you enlighten us to other states that have the same process as Michigan has of keeping out the competitiveness? Is there any other states you're dealing with that you cannot be able to come in and do business with? The same fashion with the legislation that you testified on?
I will say that in terms of the situation in Michigan, in terms of the issue with how the law is written, it's actually fairly unique among other states. And the state of Maryland actually had the same issue as well. And 2 years ago, the legislation to allow companies to apply for CPCN and then have eminent domain authority associated, it passed unanimously in the Maryland House and Senate and also was signed into law by the Maryland governor. And so the situation in Maryland was addressed to allow competitive pressures. But there are limited situations and limited examples in the U.S. of this situation. So Michigan is very much an outlier in terms of not allowing new entrants to, apply for a permit.
One follow-up, Mr. Chairman, if I can. With the rates in Massachusetts Do you have an idea, you could explain to us about their rate structure with that type of decision with the competition part? Are they in the top 10 or in the top lower 10?
You referenced Maryland, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, Maryland.
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry,
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Chairman.
I would say Maryland nationally is probably more of the middle to, they're probably in the middle of the pack range in terms of nationally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative DeAnda. Representative Griffin.
Thank you. I've heard the term Order 1000. Could you back up for a second and please give us a little context and a definition for that, because I think I know what it is, but I'm not exactly sure. Thank you.
Certainly. Order 1000 was an order that came out of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and it basically opened up certain transmission development to competition. It did not open up things such as rebuilding existing lines, but for projects that benefited a large region and were deemed at certain voltages, so there was several criteria. It just basically mandated the RTOs to put a process in place and to open up competition for large transmission projects.
And essentially, in terms of Order 1000, when it went into effect in 2011, basically, from a national standpoint, folks looked at the situation and said that, a lot of transmission in this country is probably going to be needed if you look over a 40-year horizon. And so one way to ensure that rates are just and reasonable is to allow competitive pressures into this part of the industry. And so Order 1000 has been upheld. It was a bipartisan order that came out, and it was also has been upheld by the D.C. Circuit and other courts across the country on the basis of allowing competition, and that competition is in consumers' interest.
Vice Chair Lisinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a question. LS Power has generation and transmission holdings. Can you explain how, are they held separately or together?
They're separate.
They're separate. Okay, is there ever a time where a solution might call there are two different opportunities to solve a need in a community? A generation may be able to solve it, or transmission may be able to solve it. Do you have any internal conflicts over that? You know, when we're looking at our Upper Peninsula needs, there are some opinions that generation may solve the issue there in a more cost-effective way than transmission, and vice versa. How do you handle those types of conflicts?
Basically, in terms of how LS Power is set up, we have separate independent companies, and so the companies make separate decisions related to those issues. I will say, though, what is critical, though, is MISO and PJM, when they are saying what is the right answer to a problem, and doesn't need to be transmission, doesn't need to be generation. What's critical on a regional basis is basically the regions looking and comparing transmission to generation alternatives, and certainly my company supports policies for promoting not only transmission competition, but we support non-transmission alternatives and evaluating those as well for solutions. It just makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
So, Representative LaFave.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just make sure I kind of understand this correctly. So if MISO were to offer one of these projects up, let's say it's theoretically connectivity between the Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula, your kind of understanding is that in theory you could get the bid, but in practicality, without the ability to use the threat of eminent domain, you wouldn't be able to really do it, because if you had a holdout, there's no way to get past it. So you probably wouldn't get the bid, because from an implementation standpoint, it would be very difficult to get it in at cost if you didn't have the ability to threaten eminent domain?
No, I would say that the critical aspect is that there's two issues. If there's a large transmission line that needs to be sited in Michigan, if it's above a certain voltage level, then you need a certificate and that in order to construct the line. It needs to go before the State Public Service Commission for their approval. And so, first of all, the first step for anyone, if it's above a certain voltage level, is it needs to go before the State Commission. And for the state to approve, yes, we support this, or no, we don't. Right now, because we are not an independent transmission company under the Michigan law, it doesn't give us the ability to go before the state for approval. So we are seeking the ability to come before the state for the approval, yes or no, this transmission line, period, should go forward or not go forward. And in the state of Michigan today, with that certificate process, eminent domain authority flows, but the first and most important thing is the ability to get a construction permit.
Illuminating. Thank you very much. I get it
yes.
now.
So, Ms. Segner, if McDonald's had gotten the state to pass a law back in the 1950s that the only people allowed to open a franchise hamburger place in the state of Michigan were those who had such a facility in place as of January 1st, 1960, that would be comparable to the situation you find yourself in. It would preclude competition from any future competitor. You had to exist as of that certain date in order to do business in Michigan.
That's correct. That's correct. And I would say, though, that the state is fully protected, though, in this situation relating to our situation, because a project needs to come before the state for its approval. And so if the state is not comfortable, say a 345 kV line went before the state, if the state's not comfortable with the project, the state still retains the full ability to deny or accept the project.
Thank you for your testimony this morning. Members of the committee, we've had about 5 months of background hearings and have not had much legislation come before us, but just be advised that on June 6th, I do plan to bring up Representative Cole's bill that will address this very question. So you may want to study up on this. Depending on when we recess, if we stay in session until the third week of June, which we're currently scheduled, then we would have a hearing on the 6th and probably vote it out the following week if the votes are there, or at least bring it up for a vote. However, if we learn between now and then that we're going to recess a lot earlier than that, I'm just putting people on notice, we may have the hearing on June 6th and then have the vote the same day. So just everybody, all parties involved, be advised. And with that, I need a motion to excuse Representative Garrett. Representative Deanna makes such a motion. Without objection, so ordered. The House Energy Policy Committee stands adjourned.